In Season 2 of the Nested Healing Podcast, From Surviving to Thriving, we will take you with us on our journey to the many nourishing lands of healing. With a new guest for each episode, we will get to embark on each of their healing journeys, with their curiosity being, what challenges did they face, and just how did they manage to come up on the other side? From self-love and acceptance, all the way to dance and movement, we will explore the myriad of healing components shining in each of our guests' stories. How can we relate and apply this to our own lives? How can we brighten our light through a dark tunnel? Stay with us on our beautiful deep dive into healing.
All right, welcome to the Nested Healing Podcast. I'm here with Joe today to learn about your healing journey, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm really glad to be here today.
Wonderful. Well, since this is your journey that we're going to be learning about today, I'm really curious, where would you like to start?
Well, I could tell you a little bit about myself because I think that ties into the journey. So again, Joe Zarate-Sanderlin, they, them pronouns. Assigned male at birth, but non-binary person. I am a psychotherapist in San Francisco. I have a in-person office in the Mission, and I do a lot of telehealth. I also teach at Golden Gate University in San Francisco and the Western Institute of Social Research in Berkeley. And what has been interesting about my journey is figuring out that I needed a journey in the first place. And I think this is something that has come up in my work. I started my journey as a therapist about 20 years ago. I was, in fact, interviewing for Pacifica Graduate Institute around this time, 20 years ago, and then started doing practice in 2006, and then was licensed in 2013, started teaching in 2017 or 2018. And what was interesting is the whole idea that I needed to heal came out of me becoming a therapist. And it's a funny story in terms of I didn't necessarily want to become a therapist when I became a therapist 20 years ago. I really wanted to go to Pacifica Graduate Institute, which is one of the few Jungian-based institutions, particularly in California. And one of the ways I could say, all right, I could become a therapist because that would make it something that I could justify doing, for lack of a better term. Prior to being a therapist, I was in technology, and right out of university, I was in book marketing. So what happened for me was that I thought I had a fairly typical middle-class upbringing, grew up in New York. There was one particular traumatic event when I was a kid, around 8 years old. My older brother took his own life. And only later on did I learn that there were other secrets in the family. And I think many families have secrets. And I think in some ways that was the beginning of my wounding in an explicit way, because I was really praised as the only other boy amongst the five sisters and myself that survived my brother. I was the youngest, but I was praised for not showing emotion, for being strong for my sisters. And then again, this is the late 70s. So really still on that masculine path that that nature had ordained for me, so to speak. And I learned through that showing emotion, particularly for someone who was assigned male at birth, was not what you did. And unfortunately, I did that really well. And there were other things that I look back at now, and we can talk a little bit more like, oh, there were the signs of things that were happening. And when I think about the kind of, and I'll even use air quotes, traumatic experiences that I've had, none of them, now losing my brother was significant, but he was out on the West Coast, I was in the East Coast, we didn't have a strong connection. What I experienced is what I would call glacial type of a trauma, or glacial type of an impact, rather than what I would also then call earthquake impact. So earthquake impact might be a car accident, it might be an abusive relationship, or an aspect of an abusive relationship. What I found over time is that I I didn't really get what I needed. And some people will minimize trauma. And I experienced this when I was working at GGU, where one of my students said, yeah, I was assaulted in the military. And someone said, well, that was 10 years ago. What's the big deal? And I tell this kind of funny but true story about 30 years ago, 35 years ago now, when I was in university. I was literally making the yellow pages, and I was working two jobs, and it was summer, and I was going out, and I would go to the food truck every day, and I would get a bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich every day. That bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich was scrambled eggs. One day, it was a fried egg. And that fried egg just exploded in my mouth. And to this day, 35 years later, I cannot eat fried egg. My partner loves fried eggs. One of my kids loves fried eggs. I used to be the kid who ate the 3-minute egg and put the toast in it and drank the yolk. Can't do it. I even have trouble smelling like over easy eggs. And I wouldn't even call this a trauma. I would call this an adverse event, but it shows you how something small and significant with a strong sensory aspect to it can have such a lasting impact. So circling back to your original question, I think my journey really began when I was a kid, but I didn't know it. I would say it began in earnest, partially when I met my partner, who I've been with for 30 years, but also when I started going to graduate school to become a therapist. Because once I started looking at myself, I was like, oh boy, there's some stuff that can be healed in there.
Hmm. Thanks for sharing. I really appreciate those distinctions between a more sort of dramatic and obvious trauma, or that sort of slow in the background, glacial, kind of takes a while to maybe even notice its impact kind of
Yeah.
trauma.
If there's any perceived impact at all,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
At the time. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm also curious, you mentioned also this sort of subtlety and even seeing that you needed a healing journey, right? That some of this may have been in the works earlier, but it came more into your consciousness in graduate school. So I'm curious,
Yeah.
how do you think your subconscious might have been bringing you towards a healing journey to have signed up for that grad school program? Or do you think that
Yeah.
was in play?
Well, I am a Jungian at heart, and going to a Jungian university for grad school, there was really a focus on looking inward. And I think that I had always figured that I was fine, that grew up, didn't really lack anything, but also didn't have anything extravagant, fairly typical kind of experience. But I think once I took the time to slow down a little bit and realize, so if I think about my gender, um, it never really felt right, but I didn't have language for that. I did things that were adjacent to it. So I have some Scottish heritage, so I would wear kilts. That's a way I could get away with wearing skirts, for example. But it was only in initially that beginning of therapy, and then I think a real turning point for me were two things. One, becoming a parent. So I have 12 and a half year old twins. One who was assigned male at birth, one who was assigned female at birth. The assigned female at birth kiddo has now transitioned, so I now have two sons. And at the same time, I started analysis. So literally lying on the couch with the therapist sitting behind you. And in that analysis, I realized that I was really trying hard to be a dude, and I was not good at it. And no disrespect to my analyst, I think there was this focus on you need to essentially grow up and mature. Uh, this idea that maybe I was an internal boy, right? When I changed therapists a few years ago, and we now do narrative therapy, EMDR, we do internal family systems, we do some psychedelic work. What I realized was I was parented fine, and it wasn't what I needed. So last year was the 40th anniversary of this hallmark gay anthem called Small Town Boy, which is by Bronski Beat. And I wrote an essay about it for Medium. I can share that with you later on. And, the gist of it is the love and the answers that you need can't be found at home. And I certainly felt the love, but I didn't get the answers. And part of it is I didn't even have the questions to have. And what I hope to do differently as a parent is give my children and my children's peers that ability to ask those questions or figure out the questions. But I think only becoming a therapist, finding my vocation. So as someone who was reluctant even to become a therapist, to now be teaching it, to be mentoring people, to be on the board of directors of the state level organization. These are not places that I expected to go. So I think there's an aspect there of my healing has been really transformational. Now, I wish everyone's healing could be this evocative and changing. I think that being able to lean into the profession, and yes, there are therapists who are potentially deeply wounded. There's a lot of wounded healers. And some of us, and I would include myself in that group, have engaged in this ongoing healing process. I think others of us haven't. And maybe there is more therapy that they need that they're hoping to get out of being therapists. And again, I'm trying not to be critical of some folks, but if you don't have that realization that you need to heal, then you can't begin to heal. And I think that's one piece of it. This idea that time heals all wounds is baloney, and all wounds take time to heal and effort. So the process of looking deep into myself, this is something I try to bring to my teaching. So although GGU is a fairly conventional institution, I try to encourage my students to look deep inside. Sometimes they find this very frustrating because often it's very difficult to look inside. Most of them are appreciative of it. Where I mentor students at Wiser, part of the premise is to look deep into yourself and speak in your own voice. So that's one of the appeals of working with those students, is that they are already primed to use themselves. And I think that's one of the healing pieces is I'm worthy. And not only am I worthy, I actually have wisdom that I can bring to myself and to others. And I think of all the different aphorisms, physician, heal thyself. Jung said, which I disagree with, that you can only go as deep with your clients as you've gone with yourself. I think you can actually go deep in different areas. But in the end, Jung also said something to the effect of, it's not about cutting off the parts you don't like, it's about integrating them into the whole. And I think that's one of the most difficult parts of particularly trauma healing is, why would I want to integrate this part of myself that was really difficult into myself? And I think there's a piece of, if you don't consciously integrate it, then it integrates itself or doesn't integrate itself. But if you are able to engage with it, it's similar to engaging with fear. You fear teaches you this thing you're about to do feels dangerous. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It means you should do it with caution. So I think there's a piece of understanding yourself where I have this thing called the platinum rule. You've probably heard the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The platinum rule is do unto yourself as you would do unto others, which, as many of us know, we are excellent healers of other people, and we can sit with other people's difficulty. It can be often hard to sit with our own. And I think that's the big learning piece for me, was it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to not know. I don't think it's okay to live in this sense of ignorance is bliss, or if I ignore it, it will go away. And that's the place that some people need to be sometimes. So I think that the healing that I did happened when it was supposed to happen. I don't know that it would have happened 30 years ago, but I was more primed for it to start 20 years ago and to really in its own about 10 years ago. So it's interesting to see these cycles of getting deeper and deeper.
Wow. Well, thanks for sharing all that, Joe. And there's so much that really stood out to me that I'm a little torn about which question to pursue next. Maybe I'll propose sort of two threads and you can choose from there.
Okay.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really heard in some of what you shared was about sort of gender identity and the process of discovering that over the lifespan. You mentioned that you were parented fine, but it wasn't what you needed. And so I'm kind of thinking through the sort of trauma of or adverse experience of the misattunement of gender socialization at large, and also how you're kind of breaking that cycle for the next generation with your kids and their peers by bringing the questions so they can find their answers and these types of things. So that's kind of one thread I was curious about. And then the other really has to do with sort of like the difference between, or the complement of, like introspection and education, and how language and finding those questions and finding those answers is part of the journey.
Yeah. Um, for the gender piece, I think there was a piece of giving myself permission to even look at it. And one of the things that I tell students and clients is no one sits you down as a kid and said, this is how you do communication. This is how you do conflict. This is how you do anger, the huge one, right? Or this is how you do gender identity, right? Or any sort of identity. And I think we look around and we see what's around us. And I think there's an expectation, especially my generation. I'm 55, I was born in the late 60s, grew up in the 70s and 80s. I think there was still this attachment to masculinity and maleness. There was a growing thread of feminism and understanding feminine identity, which I think often was contrasted to masculine identity. But now I think we are much more distinct in seeing those things. And it's hard to not have a space to be able to even discuss those sorts of things. And I just remember the subtle messaging around, oh, that's what girls do, or boys do this. And I was never good at sports. And, although I did play some sports, um, I wonder sometimes, I grew up essentially with five sisters, two of whom didn't live in the house when I was a kid. So they were more like aunts. And my mother, both my parents worked, but my mother did the majority of the caregiving along with two of my sisters. So I learned to cook. I learned to sew. I learned to do laundry. I learned to do all these gendered female things to the point where I got to college and people were like, oh, you know how to do laundry, you know how to cook. So only when it was necessary. But I think there was a piece of, I was almost had shame around admitting that I did these air quotes girly things, right? Um, and I wish there had been more dialogue around that. Like, my mother teaching me to do home care types of things and framing it, this is something that everyone should be doing, right? Not this messaging I got about women's work. I was somewhat effeminate as a kid, and I was often read as gay. And part of what I write in the essay, it's like in the 80s, being gay, you were either butt of jokes, and it was always very feminine, more um, uh, swishy, for lack of a better term, kind of a gay presentation, which really discounts the experience of really masculine gay men. But it was also a death sentence because it was the AIDS crisis. And now that I have studied cross-cultural therapy, the work of Darrell Tsu and his colleagues, and understanding how much of what I experienced around, whether it was people of color or LGBT folk, we're all micro and macroaggressions. So in case of the microaggressions, people weren't even realizing that they were doing them. In case of the macroaggressions, there was an acceptable quality to it. And this current experience we're having in the world is traumatic because so much of the work we've done to make the world a more equitable place, there are some people that want to undo that. And that's traumatizing not only for me, but for all of the people that are impacted by it. So I think there's a general trauma in the world that we need to be aware of now. Pacifica's motto is for the sake of tending the soul of the world. And I always love that idea of just trying to tend to that. What I appreciated in the gender journey was having the space with my partner over time and then with my peers to explore, to try on literally different clothing, to try on different presentations. I think the light bulb moment that came for me a few years ago was um, I didn't necessarily want to pass as a female or as a woman, but what I really wanted to do was pass as Joe and whoever Joe was in that moment. And I recognized the privilege of that piece, so I can present masculine very easily because I'm 6'1" and I have a prominent trachea and a deeper voice. But I also like presenting feminine, and the positive feedback I've gotten that around that, which is really the validation, is wow, you look so confident and comfortable. And I think, I wonder with trauma healing, um, sometimes it's a more subtle bit of feedback that can be really powerful. So hearing that I look confident and comfortable, it's like, all right, I'm on a good path. Is it the right path? I don't know if it's the right path. It's certainly not the wrong path. And I think your two questions really complement each other well, because part of what I've tried to bring to my teaching is myself. And for example, in my teaching at GGU, I've had the experience of I've never had a trans-identified teacher before. I recently took the train from San Francisco up to Sacramento for a board meeting, and I met a gentleman who identified as a moderate Republican, and we had a really nuanced conversation. And he really thanked me because I didn't convince him on certain things. I'm never going to convince him on the trans athletes issue, but he was able to hear some of my perspective. And it's similar to the two trans legislators that are in, I think, Montana, who spoke out to their colleagues against two really heinous bills. And something like half of the Republican contingent, so 29 out of 58 people, changed their votes. And I think part of that representation piece is when people deal with a real human being rather than an idea, then I think they're more receptive and open to things. I think that people who poo-poo trauma either don't recognize the trauma that they have received, or maybe have not had a significant trauma. Some people are shocked when I say, surgery is trauma. It's controlled trauma, but it's still traumatic. And some, oh yeah, I never really thought about it that way. And I don't want to dilute the trauma label, but at the same time, I want to open it up. So, for example, a number of my clients have been men in their 40s and 50s, in some cases 60s, who were socialized very similar to me. And they had really permissive upbringings. They really didn't have any boundaries. And they had that, they weren't grossly neglected. They also weren't nurtured. So part of it is, how do you get that nurturing? How do a lot of the work that I have done, talking about some of the specifics, is really nurturing what internal family systems would call that exile. I think inner child is probably a good way to talk about it. But really internally talking to that younger part of myself, and not simply, the Dan Savage message of it gets better, but, being able to reassure that young child that the path that they are navigating, which is sometimes really difficult to navigate, will in the end be worth it. It's kind of an interesting cycle of, can we nurture that younger part of ourselves that got wounded or traumatized and have that ripple forward to the present? And I think we can. So we can't change the past. I can't change my upbringing. I can't change the 70s, it's not the 2020s. But we can change how we think and feel about the past. And I think that's the place where in my healing, understanding where I have agency. Because I've seen some folks who, again, not to be critical, not to victim blame, but they attribute all the negative things that they have happened to them to this unresolved trauma. And that can be difficult because sometimes they don't have the ability to resolve that trauma. Some people, strangely enough, maybe don't want to resolve the trauma. Maybe there's something about it that is compelling. Some people just may not know what to do. And hopefully folks like us can guide them in that. I talk about therapy, and I think about this for myself too. I use three metaphors. A midwife, so bringing something into being, a shepherd, a guide, but who also has an investment in the flock, but also Virgil. And people say, Virgil? Well, Virgil, is the person who led Dante into hell in the Inferno, in the Divine Comedy. And that's a place that we sometimes need to go with ourselves or with clients, to really challenging places. And sometimes it's going to be scary. I love the simple idea, but he fleshes it out a little bit more. But Joseph Campbell, again, someone with Jungian influence, who also then influenced George Lucas and other makers of media, this idea of the heroic journey. So I say heroic because I try to be more gender neutral, but there are always going to be trials. There's hopefully a golden fleece. Sometimes the trial is slaying the lion. Sometimes the trial is cleaning the poo out of the stables, right? So these are different things that I've used for myself. So seeing my life as a heroic journey of heroic journeys. Thinking about the people that I've met along the way, putting some of my young behavior in context and really understanding that. One of my sons has ADHD, so autism and ADHD. And recently at a school concert, he was front and center. He has a beautiful voice. He was singing two different parts. So there's a lot going on. And towards the end of the conference, I noticed that he was rocking back and forth. And I can imagine some parents saying, oh, why can't that kid sit still? Or, huh, he's just doing that for attention. I was really proud of him because what I realized he was doing was stimming. He was using his body to relax himself in a stressful situation. And I made a note of that. I said, hey, I saw you rocking. I don't know if you even realized it. Just to recognize, even though I rock in my chair a little bit, because if there's a certain amount of nervousness, that's a, but I've been doing that my whole life, and I realize that I've been stimming, and part of what I have learned from my kids is that, yeah, I'm probably further along on the spectrum than most people. And then I look back at my life and go, oh, that thing I did makes much more sense. Or the way I perceived that experience makes much more sense. It may even play into my egg sandwich story because I have always had, and my son also has a very high sensitivity to sensation. So sound, texture, taste, smell. Of course, it makes sense in that context that this issue with the egg sandwich 35 years ago would have such a huge impact on me.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing all that. Again, so much to unpack and follow up on. I'm curious in the most immediate thread here, just sort of talking about the stimming, the rocking, and part of what I was thinking when you were demonstrating the rocking and starting that story is I was thinking some sort of self-regulation, right?
Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
curious, I noticed you said stimming to help
Mhm.
calm and relax the body. Is there a difference between stimming and regulation, or would you consider them the same, or is there a distinction?
I think most, if not all, stimming are attempts at self-regulation, but not all self-regulation is stimming.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
That makes sense.
So I wouldn't necessarily put like the breathing that we do in the stimming category, but
Mhm.
for example, what I do is I have a rock that I carry around that I can rub in my hand. And I was at an event recently. It was late on the third night of the event, and I was sitting around with my friends, chit-chatting, and I had been going like this for like 25 minutes without even realizing it. And my friend was like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" So your hand's been going, oh, didn't have my rock. So I was stimming in that moment in the way that it was most natural. And I explained it to my friend, and they nodded and they held up their knitting.
Mm.
So for them, the knitting was the stimming. And it can take a lot of forms. I mean, we think of fidgets, but I had a client years ago who had pretty significant social anxiety and really wanted to be a high school science teacher. And high school is tough for the students; it's also tough for the teachers, right? And what we came up with is when they were in front of the class, if they started to get nervous, they would do one of two things. I'm not wearing any rings right now, but they would either play with their wedding ring or they would wiggle their toes. And that physical grounding really helped them a lot because we say, oh, you should do breathing. But yeah, if you're in the middle of a meeting, you can't necessarily start box breathing. But you can wiggle your toes. Um, when I resumed doing in-person therapy, it was kind of funny because I was like, oh, what do I do with my hands now? Because for a year or so, I could, fidget with my leafy sea dragon. You can't see what I'm doing. But I'm actually relaxing. So if I was in a tense couple session, I could fidget with something a little bit. But it's been interesting. It's like, oh, I need to sit here with my hands in my lap, and that doesn't really feel natural. Um, so it's interesting, I think, what I'm seeing in both of my kids, and one is ADHD, the other one is ADHD, is I've had all this lifetime to adapt to math, to find ways to do things that work for me. And they haven't. They're 12 and a half. And only recently did we figure out that, oh, wait, here's a thing we can address. It's not just that they're tweens, they're tweens that have these particular challenges. So I think when it comes down to it, almost anything can be a kind of a stim or a kind of I think of it as a lightning rod. It's just like, where can that tension go? Um, I don't have generalized anxiety. If anything, I'm more depressive. But I do have situational anxiety. So, of course, before we started today, I was feeling a little anxious. Every time I meet a new student, I feel a little anxious. Every time I teach a class for the first time, I feel pretty anxious. And I feel confident in my ability to do these things. And the physical sensation of anxiety and the physical sensation of anticipation are pretty similar for me. So I've also done a fair amount of reframing because I would love to feel anticipation so much more than I would love to feel anxiety. And whether it's that feeling piece or there's a piece around anxiety is energy, anger is energy. I jokingly quote the mid 1970s philosopher Johnny Rotten, who was the singer of the Sex Pistols and Public Image Limited, where Public Image Limited has a song where part of the chorus is anger is energy. And knowing that anger has been really vilified in culture, and yet also the only emotion that's acceptable for male identified people seemingly to show is anger, right? And forget about if you're a socialized female, you can't show any anger at all, because that's not cool. But David Rico, who wrote a book called How to Be an Adult, don't like the title, like the idea. It's about depth psychology and spirituality. He puts anger and drama in opposition because we think about anger, but what we often see is drama. So yelling, throwing things, all of which can be traumatic, by the way. But they are anger that doesn't have a use, right? So it gets kind of spewed out in the yelling and whatnot. Versus, I think the anger that motivates us to act, motivates us to get out of an abusive relationship, motivates, you hear these stories about, guy by himself rolls up on a car accident and somehow can lift the car so that people can come out. Almost superhuman like powers. That, maybe there are, well, I know that there are things that we don't quite understand, but, maybe there are ways that we can address things that aren't teachable. And I think that's the other piece is like, as therapists, how do we teach intuition? Hey, this is what you should touch it. You should trust your intuition. It's something that develops over time. How do we learn how to make a stab at what someone is feeling? Hey, it sounds like you're feeling really frustrated. I think there's a fear in always having to be right, but it's more recognizing that you're not telling the person how they're feeling. You're making a guess about what you're observing. And when I wrote about the stimming piece in a LinkedIn post, one of the things that I suggested to people is not what's wrong with you if someone's stimming or can't you stay still, but recognizing, taking in the whole situation. Is there something that you want or need? And sometimes the thing with stimming, for example, is people don't even realize they're doing it. Like I said, with my 25 minutes of rubbing my finger and my thumb together. And there's a soothing aspect to it. One of the things that I've learned, and this came up actually at the CAMPed conference last year in LA, ran into a friend who introduced me to two other people. They invited me to lunch, and I said, thank you, and I need to introvert. And even though I was sitting at the bar, I was still by myself versus sitting at a table with three people, one of whom I know somewhat, the other two I didn't know at all, which I think would be overstimulating. So I think there's a piece of figuring out what works for you and doing it. I love, solution-based family therapy. It's like, what's working? Do more of that. What's not working? Do less of that. Very simplistic, but also, as that shepherd it's not try this will work. It is, hey, this has worked for some people. That brings in another piece of, being a therapist who's constantly healing. And I really do associate strongly with Chiron, the wounded healer. The thing about it is, and I lost my train of thought briefly there. Just because it worked for me doesn't mean it's going to work for you. And I can talk about my experience without talking about me. And this is a thing I call self-disclosure. Some people want to hear about my gender journey. They want to hear about what it's like to be a neurodivergent person, parenting neurodivergent people. But they may not need to know specifically about what I do to STEM. So I could say something like, a lot of people carry around some sort of token. For some people, it's a rock. For some people, it's a rough coin or a medallion. And they use that to rub on and stimulate themselves. So I don't need to, I showed you my rock. I talked about my rock because we're doing a different thing here. And the rock, by the way, my partner just found it on the beach and said, I think Joe would like this, and gave it to me, and didn't realize that it fit perfectly into my hand to be able to rub on it. So I think part of our job is, as healing guides, is being attentive to, hey, wait a minute, you tell me that every time you open the back door and you heard the birds sing, that calms you down. So can we maybe even do that prophylactically and make sure, 3 times a day, weather permitting, you go out to the balcony and you listen to the birds? Because ideally, we want to be proactive and not reactive. So if we can take this reactive thing, I'm so stressed out, I go outside and I feel better, to a proactive thing of like, let's try to preempt that and see what we can do with that.
There's a couple things you mentioned a little while back that I'd love to circle back around to, if you don't mind.
Please do feel free to interrupt me too.
Well,
I
yeah,
can
you're
get going.
telling us such wonderful stuff. Of course, I want to hear it. And yeah, there's just maybe two things I'm really interested in following up on.
Hmm.
Um, about your own healing journey, really. And one of them is, I think you mentioned IFS and sort of being able to bring in that nurturing, that
Yeah.
self-nurturing of the inner child. So there's that self-nurturing. And then the other thing I'm really curious about as it applies to your own healing journey is those sort of three different archetypes of ways that therapists show up, right? And I'm curious
Hmm.
how you experience those in your own healing. Who were those people for you? Or even if you don't want to name names, what were the circumstances and
Yeah.
situations that you recall from the client perspective of being shepherded
Yeah,
through all of that?
that's such a great question. I really appreciate that. Part of my spirituality is more nature-based and kind of druidic, for lack of a better term. And my internal safe space is a grove of trees. And I had created this in my spiritual practice, and my therapist and I, the one I do IFS and narrative therapy with in EMDR, we fleshed it out to have certain figures in there. So there is a really strong nurturing mother figure. There is a wise elder, which in my case kind of looks like Gandalf. There is an inspirational character, which is kind of like a fairy or Tinkerbell. As I read more about Tinkerbell, she's kind of a strange and interesting character. So I don't know how I feel about my fairy being Tinkerbell. But in terms of actual people, um, interestingly enough, the Virgil piece, I think that's something I've done for myself a lot, where whether it is in a medicine journey or in therapy, just being willing to go deep and face the, you know, suicidality, for example, which runs in my family. I would never do it, but it doesn't mean I don't feel it. And being able to say every day, not today, and have that just be applying. In terms of the midwife, I think my current therapist is really in that role because another non-binary person, they are helping me come into my being. And the shepherd was kind of interesting because I would associate that with my analyst in a lot of ways, but in maybe some of the shadow aspects of it, of being too guiding. Or what I realized is that maybe I was in the wrong flock, or maybe I was a goat and not a sheep, or something like that. um, but there has also been inspirational characters in my life, many of whom have had their own healing journeys. And I like to say that I have one foot in science and one foot in mysticism, and I believe in magic, and magic is often science that we can't explain yet. But I think there are people out there who, if you think about the concept of angels, do have an angelic quality, a healing quality. Um, and Lucifer is a fallen angel too, and a powerful one at that. So there are also, I think, some contrarian influences I've had as well. But in the end, I can really weave them into my being, and I can see places where one or another person has influenced me. And my hope, and one of the most flattering types of feedback that I have gotten, are things like, I took your class and I was a industrial and organizational psych major, and you inspired me to change to counseling psychology. And, here I am getting my license. Um, that just, to me, the fact that I had a positive influence on someone's life is so rewarding and validating. So that in itself is part of my healing. Um, I think students that recommend, oh, take one of Joe's classes because they'll do a good job, or whatnot. I think all of those wrap up into that piece. But going back to your original question, it's like, yes, there are people that have played the roles. Ideally, I am playing those roles for myself. I am, Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS. His website used to be called self-leadership, because that's ideally what you have. I think the other IFS piece that's important is acknowledging the positive influence of those managers and those firefighters as they talk about them, but also seeing the potential shadow pieces. So I like to control my environment. Sometimes that stresses me out because I try to overly control my environment. Um, there's nothing wrong with controlling your environment, but if it stresses you out to do it, then it's not necessarily helpful. Um, I also try to look for inspiring figures, and they change from time to time. Um, I encourage other folks, like, who do you look up to? Like, who do you admire? And of course, you're going to ask me who I admire right now, and I'm struggling with who I'm thinking about. But I think the people that I admire right now are the ones that are trying to go against the system. So AOC, for example, is really trying to be vocal about her advocacy work in Congress. I admire these two trans legislators in the upper Midwest who spoke out and were able to influence people. I admire Congresswoman McBride for having to deal with the transphobia on the Hill. And what I really admire her is she's not there as a trans legislator. She's there as a legislator for the people of Delaware who happens to be trans. So there's that kind of representation there. So, I think um, we try to instill hope in people, but what happens when it seems pretty hopeless? And I don't have a good answer to that question. Sometimes it means, things are just slightly better or even slightly less bad. But I also recognize that having hope is a privilege.
I wonder if, and forgive me if this is an odd question, I'm not really sure. Um, but as I'm thinking about the gender identity pieces of things, and then also thinking about the IFS and that sort of inner reparenting with the inner child, and mentioning maybe that although you were parented well, it may not have been what you needed at that particular stage in your life. So I'm curious, does that play into how IFS goes for you? Are you reparenting the child you were instead of the child you were, quote, identified as, maybe? Is there an
Yeah.
aspect of that that you find in your healing process?
Yes, I do believe so. A tough thing to wrap your head around, especially if you have overtly abusive parents. I mean, mine were just more not there. Uh, is they were probably doing the best they could with what they had. In my case, I was the seventh child, the first one born as a baby boomer, the last one born as a Gen Xer, and five in between, one of whom had taken his own life. And I was a bit of a surprise too. So I always wondered, did they really want me? Did they not really want me? I mean, I always felt loved, right? Um, and yes, I do make an effort to look back at that young person. And frequently it's kind of like between the ages of, say, 6 and 12. And it's interesting because that's, my kids are 12 and a half, and I wonder over time if it will evolve. But really nurturing that kid who um, was really trying to figure out why the world didn't make sense. And I think by the time I was in high school, so say 14 or 13, I think I just finally shrugged and go, all right, the world doesn't make sense. I'm just going to do the best I can. Um, and uh, I think, as I mentioned earlier, as I look at that part of myself, and I don't know if you experience this or the listeners experience this, we do a great job of remembering the things we didn't do well. So those missteps, those embarrassing moments, whatnot. We have a tougher time remembering our achievements because we don't need to do anything about them. But being able to go back and go, yeah, and this is the quirk of my brain and the brain of many others. Like, I remember that weird, awkward thing I did in ninth grade clearly. I probably don't remember the rest of ninth grade, but being able to go and say, that was embarrassing at the time. And the people around you just didn't understand. that you saw that situation differently. And instead of being curious, they made fun of you. And that wasn't okay. And look where you've gotten. What I try to do with my kids is I have to remember they're 12, but, you know, addressing things like bullying, because I was bullied as a kid. Maybe that's part of the slow trauma that I had. Again, for being effeminate, for not liking sports, for being weird. When people bully you or people make fun of you or people judge you, it says much more about them than it does about you, and it still hurts. And I think that's the innocence of tweens now. It's like trying to explain the way the world works, trying to explain genocide to a 12-year-old who's super curious is like, it just doesn't make sense. Trying to explain crime. Or we were in Mexico and my son noted, why are there 20 pharmacies? I said, well, the medications are cheaper down here. Oh, well, don't people need prescriptions? And I said, well, down here, you don't need a prescription. Why would someone buy a medication if they didn't have prescription? You know, there's an innocence there that I can totally relate to. Because as a kid, I to this day, I don't understand organizational politics, you know, on a board of directors or at a school or something like that. I take things at face value. And I think that can be great as a therapist, as long as you have the, you know, trust but verify piece there. And um, there are bad actors in the world, and sometimes it can be hard to suss out who they are.
I'm also curious if you'd be open to sharing a little bit more about the, I think you called them figures, right? Like the nurturing figure, the inspirational
Hmm.
figure that are in your grove and that
Yeah.
place you
So
created for yourself. Yeah.
yeah, it's interesting. We had this conversation, and the Grove had existed, but my therapist suggested that we maybe invite some figures that I can dialogue with. And, you know, one is like a sort of nurturing earth mother type who's got her little hut and, you know, you can kind of curl up in her arms. You know, the Gandalf one is, you know, an elder who can give wisdom, but, you know, also has his own flaws. And the fairy is more just like doesn't use words, right? So there's more body inspiration. And I think um these figures have not shown up in my medicine journeys. Other people have shown up in my medicine journeys, but I think there's a place there for, you know, the fairy figure is teaching me to accept body wisdom and accept I'm so wordy. I'm so, you know, probably overeducated. Tended to intellectualize things. I'm not going to be able to understand some things with words. And I think that's what happens for me sometimes, that I want to try to put words to something. And as I do more work in the medicine journeys, I think it also deepens my IFS work because I'm able to see parts of myself. And, you know, the thing about it is those three helpers that are in my grove are also parts of me, right? Projections. When one of my sons was having some mental health challenges, I told him about my grove, and I'm like, you know, you can make your own or you can come visit mine, you know, and there wasn't an expectation that he would necessarily do it, but I wanted to offer, again, like I said earlier, here's a thing that has helped me. You know, what I probably don't do enough of in these very busy times is go sit in the grove, you know, and it's wonderful living in a city like San Francisco where there are a number of different free places that I like to go to. So maybe that's a reminder for myself now that the weather is nice again to seek out some of those places. Um, in particular, in Golden Gate Park, there's an AIDS grove, but there's smaller groves within that that some people have used for ceremonies in the past. So maybe spending some more time out there would be good for me. Literal and, figurative.
That's so cool. And I love how the grove reflects also the sort of internal family system as well, that those are parts.
Mm.
And I'm curious, this is the therapist in training in me who's just starting to learn IFS and is very much a beginner. But I'm curious sort of when you are working with that, when you're in that grove, either on your own, in your own self-care time or in sessions, um, and if those protector parts are there for you to dialogue with and help in that moment, are you dialoguing with them as the exile, as the inner child who needs that healing and support, or as the self, like the self energy leadership, or does that change in different
You
times?
probably know the answer is yes.
Okay.
It really depends.
Mm.
Um, what's interesting is I think there's something almost, I don't know if ephemeral is the right word, gaseous, like um, there's something about that inner child. I should talk to my therapist about this. That is um, not solid, right? It's like that's why I say gaseous or some sort of mistiness to it. So there's, I think, less of a um, fully fleshed out figure there. So I think the dialogue is more with the self, but there's an aspect of that exile that kind of is maybe the mist in the grove or the smoke from the fire, that sort of a thing. It makes me wonder for me, like, is there a exile, or is there is that a accumulation? We talked about glacial change earlier, or glacial impact. Is that an accumulation of experiences that doesn't take on a particular solid form, yet permeates everything?
Mm.
And
Yeah,
the cool thing about it is you can do it more or less however you want.
that's very cool. And then, I have questions too about these figures, these other parts, the protector parts in the grove. And
Hmm.
um, from the little that I'm starting to learn about IFS and protector parts, there's a sort of change in the role or transformation. It's not that the part goes away, right? But there's
Hmm.
an evolution of that part's role or function after they've had a chance, each part, to go through their own healing process and unburdening and being able to choose a
Hmm.
new way to show up. And I'm noticing the sort of archetypes you mentioned there are very supportive and positive. And I'm curious, are these parts who've gone through and kind of done their own work in a sense that have gotten to a new role?
Yeah, so I like that framing. I think in all three cases, they are in a constant transformational process, but they are, you know, not parts that I necessarily get blended with, to use the IFS terminology, but who I like to have around because they help out. Um, and I think maybe that's the thing that we don't talk about enough in IFS is like, yes, we want to be self-led, but there's some real wisdom in those parts that we want to keep with us. Um, I suppose there are times that I might get blended with if I become nurturing again, because it's an aspect of me, right? If I become nurturing to my own detriment, or if I over intellectualize, or if I um the fairy part is also kind of ADHD, so she flips all over the place. There are positive aspects in the same way that there are mostly positive aspects, good intention for all of the parts. So even something like, they talk about firefighters, they mean good for you, and it might be numbing you out, or it might be forcing you to feel, one way or the other. Um, these ones, I think, have gotten to a place where they very rarely do they have negative side effects. So I'm kind of happy to have them around. Um, but yeah, I think it's more the self dialoguing with them of like, you're my standing committee. Like, come help me out here. Um, it's also nice to find people in your life who have that kind of a role, so um, people that are inspiring like the fairy, or people that are wise, or people that are nurturing. And it is interesting. It's like, even in my grove, the nurturing one is the more female motherly. The wisdom one is more masculine elder. The inspirational one is more just flitting all over the place. So there's still some gendered thinking in there. It's not to say that it couldn't be the other way around, but um yeah, and I really appreciate these questions because they're giving me more perspective on how I can work with this in ways that I hadn't thought about. And I think that's a great example of how this is really an evolutionary process. That, healing doesn't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Hopefully, it has a beginning and a middle. And it, ideally, we are cured, I suppose, but I don't know that we're always cured. I think that's one of the toughest things about trauma or adverse experience is that there's a likelihood that it may never go away. Um, People don't necessarily like to hear this, but I am depressed. I will always be depressed. When I get stressed out, I go towards depression, sometimes anger. Some people are more anxious and they're never not going to be anxious. People ask me, "Oh, I don't want to be anxious anymore." It's like, I can't do that. I can help you manage the anxiety. And it's not to say that I am unhappy. And my definition of happiness is contentment with just enough contentment with just enough discontent to keep you moving forward. So I feel relatively content with a good amount of discontent to move me forward. Um, and I know that that can turn on its own if something adverse happens, or I recently was treating one physical injury and triggered another physical injury, treating the first physical injury. Ironically, the treatment for both of the injuries is very similar. So at least the overlap of the physical therapy is good. But we don't want the healing to re-traumatize. So how do we work through those experiences? I don't necessarily have the answer. How do we work through those experiences without re-experiencing them at the same time and having them be re-traumatizing?
That's such a good point. I'm glad that you brought that in because like healing and trauma, it's not so black and white. It's not I'm 100% traumatized and I'm 100% healed, right? And
Yeah.
there is that whole journey that could be lifelong, really in between, continuing to peel like layers of an onion, right? Like it can be always ongoing. And I'm curious as you're bringing in, and thank you for sharing this with us, bringing in this sort of baseline of depression or a tendency towards depression that can always be there, and for some people, anxiety. Um, that kind of also brings to mind to me sort of like a window of tolerance of like what's
Mhm.
within the realm of my normal baseline window, and how can I be working with that and being really aware of tending to when I'm outside that window of tolerance.
All right.
And
And how long can I tolerate being outside of it, and how do I get back into it?
yeah, yeah, and I'm curious if you would mind explaining that a little bit more for our listeners, that sort of concept, and also sort of how you've found ways of working with that, with knowing that you have a baseline that
Yeah.
tends towards one side. Mhm.
I think the first piece is really recognizing that there is something like a window of tolerance, or a, ability to deal with adversity. Um, I think some folks who have had traumatic experiences, or who have traumatic lives, people of color or other people outside of the dominant culture who are often targeted, build up a kind of callus that can insulate them from some of the effects, but also reduce sensitivity. So maybe a similar thing might be, if you are having an adverse mood, you want to, potentially through medication or through CBT or whatnot, you want to moderate that mood, but you don't want to numb the person. You don't want to treat one condition and trigger another. So for example, we can give people Wellbutrin for depression, but if you tend towards anxiety, it may make you more anxious, right? There's an interesting phenomenon of some people are so depressed that we give them antidepressants and they end up actually harming themselves because they feel more put together to be able to actually take action, which is ironic. It's not a reason not to do it. You need to monitor it. So for me, touching that window of tolerance is important. So I think some people try to avoid all kinds of discomfort. I have a saying, many of us therapists have these sayings: life is uncomfortable. You can be uncomfortable now on your terms or later on someone else's terms. And I use this with my students in particular around, if you've had a trauma, you don't want to be triggered for the first time with sitting with a client. Maybe it's better to be triggered in a role play, or it's better to have done your own therapy or whatever. Still may not prevent it, right? So I think there's a piece of touching that window of tolerance. Now, I talked earlier about my egg story. I had just had no desire to try to address that window of tolerance. I'll eat scrambled eggs, it's fine. I have omelets, it's great. But if it was causing me to not live my life, we talk about this thing in the DSM, and cause this significant distress in work, school, home, all that sort of thing. Like, I don't need to eat runny eggs. That's fine. So I'm not touching that window of tolerance, but I am a card-carrying introvert. And that is always not great for self-promotion, especially when trying to become a more successful private practice therapist. So part of my window of tolerance work at the CAMP conference was I tried to raise my hand and say something relevant at each session that I went to, or contribute something relevant in each conversation I had without dominating the conversation. But I will tell you, every time I raised my hand, I could feel my heart rate go up. I could feel the sweat in my pits. I could feel maybe even like a little bit of scratchiness in my voice, because I know that's still an edge for me. This coming CAMP conference in May, I'm on the board of directors now. I'm going to be sitting on the stage. I'm going to be visible. And that's going to be an interesting experience. When I do things like this, it's interesting. Like, this feels really comfortable. When you tell me the episode is going to drop, I'm going to be like, did I say? People are going to hear that. So it's interesting. It's like, I don't feel nervous now, but I know I will feel nervous in the future. So there's a piece of, it'll be fine. Like, I'm telling my story, I'm being authentic. Hopefully I'm helping some people. But some people just don't want to touch that window of tolerance. Kids who don't want to go to school because it's hard, or I don't feel well. And part of me is like, well, if you're haven't broken anything, you're not bleeding, throwing up, or having diarrhea. If your belly feels a little bit off, you may just have to go to the wellness center and chill out, which is not to say like I don't care that my kid's not feeling well, but how do you build that window of tolerance without facing some sort of adversity? So here, I think, is a place where we talk about the good enough mother, Winnicott's idea. And the not good enough mother is a problem because that's neglect. But the too good mother is also a problem because that is not letting your kid experience any sort of adversity. And this can set up this cycle of like, I did everything for you. It's like, yeah, but you didn't need to. And in you doing everything for me, I didn't learn to do anything. And therefore, when I got out of college, I didn't know how to do a bank account. Now, fortunately for me, I did learn all those things. There were other places that I weren't supported. But, sometimes we want to do, as clinicians, people say, well, I don't want my clients to be uncomfortable. And I said, well, that's probably the wrong attitude. You want to make it safe for them to feel uncomfortable. And I think that's the thing for me is, how do I push myself that little bit so that I can touch the discomfort and have it be okay?
That's so powerful. And that reminds me, coming back to those three different metaphors or archetypes for showing up as therapists. And there's discomfort in all of those, right? Like the midwife, like person going through that birthing process is experiencing some discomfort you
Yeah.
don't want to avoid, discomfort that's necessary to get to
Yeah.
the next stage, right? And of course,
Mhm.
with all the others as well.
Yeah. Well, and even just if I think about the shepherd, you're responsible for a flock, you're out maybe in the elements, you're maybe alone. Um, one of the ways I talk about depression and anxiety, I my first master's in English, and I studied Milton. And John Milton has two poems, one of called L'Allegro, which is the active man, and then Il Penseroso, which is the thoughtful man. And I always thought about L'Allegro as anxiety and Il Penseroso as depression. So if we notice during COVID, a lot of depressive introverts did great because it was like, all right, I don't have to go anywhere, I don't have to do anything. I'm kind of stuck with the same group of people, but that's okay. The uh, outgoing extrovert types were really struggling because they really thrive on connection with other people. And as good as a job as we've tried to do with Zoom and other media, it's still not 100% the same. And I think that's where the pushback around I see with clients, one will have a lower tolerance for COVID, other one will have a higher tolerance. And it tends to be the introvert has the lower tolerance for going out, and the extrovert has the higher tolerance for going out because that they really thrive off of that energy. Um, and yeah, and sometimes those different roles, like the when I was training as an EMT, they said, EMTs don't birth babies, mothers birth babies, or gestational parents birth babies. And they're still, it's kind of funny, air quotes to me, that, part of puberty education still seems to be showing kids um, really complicated births rather than, a basic smooth birth, right? Um, but yeah, each of those different archetypes has its positive qualities and it has its challenges to it. I think the shepherd one is kind of interesting because we can be very isolated unless we make an effort to not be isolated. And that's why I tell my students, keep in touch with each other, keep in touch with me, join a consultation group, join CANFT or whatever organization that's relevant to you in your state or area. Just because um, part of our work, and whether this is healing trauma, whether this is doing therapy, whether this is teaching, is feedback. And if you're not getting feedback, like I said earlier, that feedback of, oh, I changed my major because your class inspired me. Great feedback, right? Um, but if we are operating in this vacuum, and I think sometimes people that are recovering from trauma may close inward because they don't want to talk about the trauma, or they don't want to relive the trauma, or maybe they thought they're the only person who's gone through that trauma, or maybe too many people have gone through that trauma, or their trauma seems trivial, or their trauma seems too big. It's people will ask me about that. It's like some people will give you their trauma history in the first session, and I sometimes wonder, it's like, can this person handle what I'm bringing to the table? Right. Other people, it might be 6 months before they even touch the trauma, or they came in for one thing, but that's what got them through the door. And what they really need to do is address this traumatic experience.
Yeah, and another thing I'm noticing that's like a theme between those three different archetypes of the midwife and the shepherd and Virgil is they are creating the safety, like you said, making it safe to be with the discomfort, right? Creating the safety and the
Yeah.
support for the container um therapeutically, but that there's also an awareness, that sort of therapeutic skilled training awareness of where is the client within their window of tolerance, right? Like if
Mhm.
they've gone outside of it, how can we ground in this moment and come back inside of the window? And there's
Right.
nothing provocative of like I'm gonna trigger this person outside of their window, right? It's like this is the discomfort this client is dealing with, right?
Yeah.
Whichever discomfort it is, and how can I create the safe relational container for it to be felt so that it can be
Hmm.
processed and digested and,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and it's, it's not our goal to make people feel uncomfortable. It's not our goal to make people cry. And we don't make
Exactly.
people feel uncomfortable. We don't make them cry. I believe what we try to do is create the environment for that to be safe.
Yeah.
And sometimes that is just a holding pattern. Sometimes that is turning up the heat a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a David Martin, is a Canadian therapist whose book I've used in the past, and um, uh, there's a piece of what he calls, I think there's another researcher, evocative empathy. So we're not trying to provoke,
Mm-hmm.
we're trying to evoke. And there may be times that we provoke, and I think about that scene from A Few Good Men with Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholas, where he just really goes at him until he burns. That's not generally what we want to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we may want to shine some light on something. Earlier, I said, we're not telling someone how they feel, but if they're telling us a story and we say, "Wow, you feel really cheated. It sounds like you feel really cheated." Um, Notice I corrected myself there because I said, "You feel cheated," and I said, "You sound really cheated." So I want to make sure it's coming from me. It may be hard for them to name that, or they may not have access to that emotional language. But, there are times that I have said one word or two words, and someone will just open up and the tears will start. And that's also feedback. There's a piece of like, okay, I think that hopefully in a positive way, excuse me, opened up something for the client. It's interesting with practicum students who are like, I felt so bad, I made my client cry. I'm like, no, 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 no. You created an environment where it was okay for them to cry.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to also, we don't want to like overly praise something like crying or emoting, but we also don't want to discount it. So how do you just sit with that sometimes? Because I think as people wired to be healers, we want to come in and soothe. And sometimes they've been holding stuff inside for months or weeks or years, and they need to let it go. And it's we seem to have this issue with crying that we don't have with laughing. Now, of course, there are times that it's inappropriate to laugh, but generally, it seems to be okay to laugh, but not okay to cry. When I was an EMT, I can remember rolling up on car accidents, and you would have someone with like a broken bone and bleeding and whatnot. And they're holding the steering wheel, and the airbag has gone off, and they are giggling hysterically because that's the overflow that they have. And they could equally be crying hysterically. Um, we know that people cry because they're happy. We also know that people cry because they're sad. So I think holding that space for emotion. The other thing that the shepherd, the midwife, and to an extent Virgil, they're all, and we talk about this, experts in the process. So the midwife has birthed children before with other gestational parents. The shepherd has tended other flocks. Virgil has guided presumably other people. So as therapists, we are hopefully gaining expertise in the process. The client or clients, they are the experts in their content. And one challenging piece there is they may not know that. They may not know what to share. They may not know, they may be talking about this thing and you're like, wow, there's like some sort of adverse experience in here. And all of a sudden, like, oh yeah, didn't I tell you this thing happened? Oh, and they don't recognize that necessarily that there's a connection. Maybe there's a defensiveness there. Maybe there is hey, I don't want to believe that this thing happened or this person did this thing. But sometimes it's us going, yeah, I wonder what that's about. Curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad we had the opportunity to have you here on this episode. And thanks for sharing both from your own personal perspective and also a therapist perspective. It's been really great talking with you.
Yeah, likewise. I really appreciate the questions. And as I said earlier, it's actually given me more insight into how I can work with my material. And just the opportunity that you're giving to me and to others to talk about our journeys, I think really shows people that there isn't one right way to do it. And I think that's one of the challenges with like this therapy or that therapy or this other therapy. It's like, no, there's no one right way to do it. There's probably a ton of wrong ways to do it. But I think hearing people's stories helps externalize, helps people recognize that they're not alone. It may feel very alone, but just know that there are people who have walked their journeys in the way that you have, and some of us have walked them already, and some of us will walk them in the future. But in it, we're all in it together in that sense.